QSO Today, episode 416, Ron Hardman VA3ON. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest amateur radios and accessories for your ham radio station, and by Nuts and Bolts Magazine. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur callsign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. A few notes before we get started today. We are 2 weeks away from the 5th QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo on the weekend of September 17th and 18th. The expo is on Pacific Daylight Time and actually begins at 6 p.m. Friday evening, September 16th. We have over 50 amazing presentations, some interesting contributions to our new project gallery, and eyeball QSOs in our Kumo Space virtual lounges. Our Kumo Space technology has really evolved into an amazing way for us all to meet without leaving home. Flex Radio is our platinum sponsor, and the ARRL is our partner in the expo. Please join me and my friends for the weekend, and keep in mind that with 50 presentations, you may not be able to see all of them during the weekend, but that they will be available during the 30-day on-demand period afterwards. Your ticket purchase of $10 makes it possible for Ben and I to edit and add the question and answers that follow the presentations to all of the videos before we put them on our Vimeo video library. The video player that we built last year, that is blind and vision impaired friendly, is back up on our site with over 200 presentations currently available for viewing. Go to the QSO Today hamexpo.com website or click on the banner in this week's show notes page to get your ticket. Rod Hardman VA3ON is one of the hosts of the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, and while a relatively new ham, has a love for hands-on radio technology and tools that goes back to the 1970s. Rod played an interesting role with his company in New Orleans just after Hurricane Katrina that renewed his interest in amateur radio, finding his community, and eventually building his own tribe. VA3ON tells his story in this QSO Today. VA3ON, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Rod?
4Z1UG, this is VA3ON. Great to talk to you, Eric.
Rod, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Eric, I was a bit of a slow starter in amateur radio. I had all the right ingredients. I love science. I like particularly physics. I took apart machines around the house, much to my mother's delight. I loved and I still love all sorts of tools. And I even became a bit of an expert in the neighborhood at installing telephones back in the 70s when you weren't supposed to do that, to do telephone extensions. So even at 9 years old, I got to run around the neighborhood and put in phones.
So let's go back there a little bit. First of all, what was the hometown?
Oakville, Ontario.
Oakville.
Yes.
Ontario is a territory in Canada.
Yes, it's Oakville is a town in Ontario, which is central Canada, west of Toronto. So if you think of North America, you can put Toronto right in the Great Lakes, and we're just on the border, well, towards the border, western of Toronto.
So you're west of Toronto, north of the Great Lakes?
Yes, right on the Great Lakes, on Lake Ontario.
On Lake Ontario. And then we have the big American desert to the Rockies, right?
Yes, the Great Plains.
The Great Plains. Because people forget that Canada also has Great Plains.
We've got a massive agricultural section. I mean, most Canadian population is close to the border. It's not far north of the parallel that separates the United States and Canada. But we have massive, massive agricultural lands through Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta.
Now, your love of tools as a kid, did your father, did he have a well-equipped garage and tools?
No, quite the opposite, actually. It skipped a generation. My grandfather did. And thankfully, they're fairly close, about a half an hour drive away from us. My grandfather was a machinist in World War II. He was probably old for World War II, all things considered. But he had an amazing set of tools, and that's where I got the love of it, is I'd hang out in the basement, and he'd actually let me do all sorts of stuff. all by myself down in the basement in Georgetown. But loved it, got an appreciation. It's one of those things you look back on it. I wish I had asked him more questions and learned more techniques from him.
Now, as a retired machinist, did he have like a lathe and a mill and a drill press and those kinds of things in his basement?
Yes, absolutely. He had a lathe that took up most of the shop. And there was also a drill press in the corner and some other sundry tools on there, and then some things out in the backyard in a shed. But the majority of it was a lathe, multi-function lathe that was in the basement, and it was scary when you were a kid because it spun at high speeds, and that part I wasn't allowed to mess with. But everything else I had free reign over.
He was a maker, even in his retirement.
Yes, and had he been around for the computer age, I think he would have been wholeheartedly involved because he would make stuff like half the stuff in the house was made. So I did get my love of it from him because he had the skills. And if I had one regret, it's not being able to go back and learn more from him.
So then it skipped a generation, and you had this interest. And how did you have this interest in telephones? I remember this time, I think maybe Canada was behind the United States. We had in the 70s what was called the Carter Phone Act.
Right.
Right, and the Carter Phone Act, up until that time, for younger people that might be listening to the QSO Today podcast, before that time, the Bell system owned everything, including the phones in your house, and they were hard attached to the wall, and if you needed to move the phone around, they came out and put a 25-foot cord on it. But otherwise, there were no modular jacks. Your phone was dedicated where your phone was.
Absolutely, and you will not touch that unless a certified Bell technician comes out to your house. And there were all sorts of restrictions on it. Well, we did have that opening up that happened. You were allowed to move your phone in the house, but you had to have a jack. And all of these things that Bell sort of told you, but sort of didn't. Well, this was fascinating to me. So I was taking apart the phones in the house and figuring out how all this worked. And I was able to get jacks from a local store. I think it was actually the Radio Shack that you could get the first jacks from, these big modular 4-prong things.
That's right.
You'd be able to take them out. So I installed all these things around the house. Well, the neighbors got wind that I'd done this and I knew something about it. So before long, I actually had my own, what they call a butt set, which is a little test phone set that's you can get fairly easily these days. But back in the day, it was hard to get. I think it was my dad helped me secure that. And I had my own little telephone extension business. So good fun. But tying in with that, we had just moved into a neighborhood, in this new neighborhood. It's up on an escarpment overlooking Lake Ontario, which it has advantages down the road. But this was a brand new subdivision. And across the road from me was the Champagnes. We were the only two houses that were finished in this massive neighborhood. And I got asked to come over and, do the phone thing over there, really more to meet because they had a son, Louis, who was older than me, real teenager. And we were the only kids in the neighborhood. And Louis kind of tolerated me. There's probably like a 4 or 5 year gap between us. He's an actual teenager, but we became fast friends. We launched a little reign of terror in the neighborhood, getting scraps from the building sites, and we constructed an entire building in a neighboring ravine, including electricity. So that was good fun. But the main thing with Lou was he was a whiz with electronics. He had an entire electronics shop in the basement that he shared with his dad, who, by the way, was also Lou, VE3ALB. What a great guy, a real mentor and a superhuman CW operator. So that was my first exposure to ham radio, and I immediately wanted to become a ham. So I said, well, where do I start? Well, you need to learn CW. Well, what's that? Well, that's Morse code. Great. So I thought, okay, went running off to the library and started studying CW, and I did it the absolute wrong way, right? So you're looking at dots and dashes. I'm memorizing those or trying to. And I had my standard was that I should be as good as old Lou, right? That's what you did. That's what a good CW operator was. And now looking back on it, I know that Lou was an incredible operator. So this standard that I had was completely impossible.
So you set the bar very high.
It was incredibly high. And so I looked at this and went, oh, I'm terrible at this. Okay, I should give up. And I just went on and did other stuff. And these are the bad decisions that you make when you're 10 years old, right? So that was it for ham radio. Didn't go back.
So what happened, Rod? You blow off amateur radio for a while. What did you do? What fascinated you as a kid after that?
I spent my teenage years with the Army Cadets in Canada, and that's the equivalent of the JROTC program. So it's a youth program. It's run by the Army. That's where I got interested in radio again. And so by this time I'm 12, 13. You're learning all sorts of stuff. The unit that I was with had these ancient, they called them 42 sets. I think they were Plessis. And they came out of Jeeps during World War II, these massive things. And they had these horrible man packs, 510s, that were left over from probably Korea era. And boy, these things had to be coached into working at all. You had certain things that you'd figure out how to do, and you learn proper phonetics, proper voice procedure. It was really fun. And it came in handy, even later as a reserve officer. But you had to learn all of this stuff, and it was a real skill. We had our own frequencies. You just learned a lot, but you were essentially appliance operators. And then the next level of skill was to figure out how to get the connectors to work properly, that sort of thing. And that took me really through high school, did all sorts of crazy stuff there. Near the end of that, I ended up getting a position to go over to Europe, attached to a mechanized infantry company. So I went over with a real regular force unit on a placement, essentially. It was really, really fun.
Forgive me. Nobody thinks of the Canadian Army, or that even Canada has an army, let alone taking a mechanized division over to Europe.
We were the nice guys in Europe, right? We used to hang around with the Americans because they had good food. And we had great rain gear, by the way, much superior rain gear to the Americans, and they like to trade certain things with us, some of our fresh rations, that kind of thing. So you get a fair bit of stuff. It's a real community overseas in NATO. We were out of Baden-Sulligan and Lahr, so communities out there. You have this fall exercise. You run around in these vehicles, and there is a lot of radio work. And, of course, you're looking for any excuse to be more useful to your company commander, right? You want to be – I was a decent medic and a good navigator, even with the cryptic German maps that we had, which were a real skill to pick up. But you wanted to get a bit of an extra edge. So I learned as much as I could about the radios we had in the vehicles, just building on the knowledge I had and how to get a little extra out of them. So I soon became known for the guy that if they were having trouble with the vehicle sets or even the man packs, to go talk to Rod. And that was a lot of fun. But, let's be clear on what these supposedly magic skills were. Like, one of the most common things I ever did was disconnect the handset, clean the contacts with the end of an eraser from a pencil, and put it back together again. I mean, not exactly rocket science, but this was the mechanized infantry.
And now this message from ICOM America. Heard it, worked it, logged it. This summer, keep your competitive contesting edge with ICOM. Our high-powered base stations cut through pile-ups, letting you work the bands and log those contacts. Contest from the comfort of your home or remotely with the RS-BA1 app. The ICOM IC7851 gives you a new window into the RF world, and its on-air excellence is unparalleled. With faster processors, high input gain, high display resolution, and a cleaner signal, it's truly the pinnacle of HF perfection. Features include dual receivers, digital IF filters, memory keyer, digital voice recorder, high-resolution Spectrum waterfall display, enhanced PC connectivity, and an SD memory card slot. The ICOM IC7610 is the SDR every ham wants. This high-performance SDR can pick out faint signals in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The ICOM IC7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio that has changed the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. Its features include RF direct sampling system, 110 dB RMDR, independent dual receiver, and dual digicell. Create your own band openings with the ICOM IC9700. This transceiver brings direct sampling to the UHF-VHF weak signal world. This all-mode transceiver is loaded with innovative features that are sure to keep you busy that include faster processors, higher input gain, higher display resolution, and a cleaner signal. This has become the new de facto standard as a baseband rig for microwave operation as well. Features include 4.3-inch touchscreen color TFT LCD, real-time high-speed spectrum scope and waterfall display, smooth satellite operation with 99 satellite channels, dual-watch operation, and full duplex operation in satellite mode. The ICOM IC7300 is a high-performance, innovative HF transceiver with a compact design that will far exceed expectations. This innovative HF transceiver digitizes RF before various receiver stages, reducing inherent noise in different IF stages. The IC7300 changed the way entry-level HF is designed. It is the go-to rig in my station now, and I love it. Features include RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, and an SD memory card slot. Just know that you'll be very pleased with one of these fine rigs to enhance your contest, DX, and general ham radio operation in your station. Be sure to check out these ICOM rigs and their full line of base stations and portable radios at an amateur radio dealer near you. And when you make that purchase of a fine ICOM rig, be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on the QSO Today podcast. And now back to our QSO Today. What I think that most people, even today, wouldn't know how to screw an antenna on the end of a walkie-talkie, for example, or how to replace the battery. I think maybe we kind of underestimate, the skill sets that we have. Let's go back just a little bit. You said you had an interest in the sciences and physics and stuff, and while you did the Canadian Army Cadets in high school, here in Israel, the high school actually has a major. You can actually specialize in certain things. Did you specialize in something that helped you make a decision whether or not you stayed in the infantry and the mechanized division, or that you were going to go to college afterwards? What kind of decisions were you making as a teenager?
I was absolutely convinced that I was going regular Army. And I had it all laid out on how I was going to, and I had ambitions to be an officer, and I ended up eventually being an officer, but regular Army full-time, that's what I wanted to do. And it was during my time in Germany, and I distinctly remember, it was about 3 a.m. on the side of a hill overlooking a valley, and I was sitting there with who I considered to be an ancient sergeant that I worked with, and out of Newfoundland, as all good sergeants are. And I'll get some mail on that one. But looking over this valley, and we're sitting there in the quiet, and he just turns to me and he says, Hardman, you're pretty good at this, but I can absolutely guarantee you're going to be bored in a couple of years. And that hurt me. That just destroyed me in that moment, because it set a course of events that had me question whether I wanted to go regular Army or not. And that was the best advice I ever had, because as much as I loved it, and I was kind of good at it, he was right. I was going to be bored, and I needed a little more challenge in my life. So, I went off to university and had a bit of a business program that I went through, because that was really what our family did. When I said it skipped generations, my dad was a big businessman. And I was lucky enough, just with the timing, to be in university when a great deal of innovation was happening with PCs versus mainframes. And I managed to have my own business, essentially, putting together proposals for university profs to get PCs onto their desktops. IBM PC-ATs were the latest and greatest. Some were just regular PCs if they couldn't afford it. Get the grant programs written for them. Get them installed with Twin-X connections back to the mainframe, and get this all up and running. I had a new PC on my desk throughout university because there was always something that was being configured for a prof on the way through. It was a wonderful opportunity. I had the very best time of it, and with superb timing.
So you were working while you were going to school?
Oh, I absolutely had to. Yeah, I ended up really struggling financially through university, and this made it possible for me to go through it.
And what university did you go to?
Carleton University in Ottawa. Not well known, but a fun university. And Ottawa's a very cold city. And Carleton is got tunnels that connect all of the buildings. So it means you can wear a light jacket and travel through the tunnels in the middle of the worst winters ever. So great place for that.
Or you could schlep the computers for the professors through the tunnels, right?
On a cart through the tunnels. Yeah, absolutely. That was me many days.
And did you have a business name, or were you just Rod Hardman, the computer guy?
I was kind of running under the radar because a lot of times I would get paid I was a TA, teaching assistant, and they would find ways of funneling money through the TA pay mechanisms to get stuff done that way. So, yeah, it was kind of this whole underground economy thing, but it worked out extremely well.
And what did you end up majoring in?
Business and economics. Again, kind of weird because what I did is when I exited out of university, when I graduated, the first jobs I went for were actually oriented towards CAD, computer assisted design. So, all that business stuff, yeah, it was kind of useful. But really went into kind of a technical field and then ultimately, worked for a number of companies that were Autodesk products, that kind of thing. So lots of design work. So I got to hang out with a lot of engineers and often regretted not going down the engineering path. But it's okay. I got to work with them, and that was a lot of fun, too.
What, maybe be in charge of projects that might have had engineers? Yeah,
we had some fairly sizable things all the way from big retail chains through one of my early accounts was all of the CAD that was used at Quebec Hydro and Ontario Hydro. So hundreds and hundreds of workstations through there. So it was a fairly big account to manage, and I wasn't that old when I was managing it, which was kind of hilarious.
What were you doing for fun in those days?
So I came fairly quickly, evolved through a number of jobs, and ended up at Hewlett-Packard. There were a number of folks that were not just technical in our jobs, but technical hobbyists. And that's, again, remember I say I came late to this, but I sure had a lot of people pushing me in the direction. So with that group, I got interested in still building things. I did a lot of carpentry. I did a lot of shed building work like that. So really more maker stuff oriented towards that. A lot of volunteer stuff. It's actually how I met my wife, was building a barn, because she was crazy enough to think that a barn was a good idea. But we ended up doing that. And I just learned a lot about tools, kind of extending on that information. But what I was going to say was there were a number of mentors I had at Hewlett-Packard, including Hildy Allman, let's see if I can remember, VE3ECE. She's a silent key now, and her husband, Jim Allman, he's now BC, VE7XHP. I love that call sign. Anyways, these guys were all pestering me to get my license. But it wasn't until I got recruited into an HP group that was sent to post-Katrina. So Katrina rolled through in, 2005 in September? And in early 2000, around the Christmas break in 2006, there was a group that formed in North America to do some support, some post-rebuilding in New Orleans. And they were recruiting folks. There was a guy by the name of Bob Gann, who was a volunteer fire chief out of our Colorado office. And he was picking people who had skills and background and didn't mind being dirty to go down to work in St. Bernard Parish, which is right close to, just to the east of New Orleans. I was part of that group, very small group. And wow, this was the limit of skills and background and improvisation. In fact, I think if the HP lawyers knew the amount of amateur electrician work I did in one of those buildings that was completely washed out, I think they would have been terrified. But it was really, really good fun. But it was there that I had the big inspiration to get back into amateur radio, because I'd never seen that level of destruction before. We had rental SUVs and pickups that we could move around with, But if you didn't have a GPS, and Bob and I were the only ones to bring our clunky GPSs with us, we would have never been able to get around because New Orleans was washed out completely. There were no street signs. There were literally no street signs.
So you just had this big grid of paved road, right? And devastation.
Yeah, where it wasn't washed out. So we were moving from A to B, and it was just about impossible. No electricity, of course. Still, like any electricity that was by generator. And the thing that we were really glad we brought our GPSs. We were really glad that we brought our own tools. What we weren't counting on was the fact that cell phones, forget it. We had these little flip phones that were kind of had service. We needed radio. And Bob, being a firefighter guy, and I were talking about this constantly, going, we should have brought amateur radio gear. We should have got everybody on the team licensed. And so when I came back from that, which was early 06, I guess, that was the first thing I did.
I'd never heard this story in terms of Hewlett-Packard sent employees down to New Orleans to help rebuild. Were you being paid as if you were working at Hewlett-Packard as a volunteer down there?
Yeah, it was a short stint. Okay, let's be clear. The parish brought some folks in that we knew of that were doing some consulting to get their IT infrastructure up and running. We helped them a little bit. We also did a bit of a PR thing down there. Our big publicity event was we went and restored a bunch of destroyed photographs. So we parachuted a whole bunch of, not literally, we brought in a whole bunch of gear, computers, printers, large format things, and a whole bunch of satellite uplink. And it allowed us to collect photographs, damaged photographs from residents that they had, by now they're cleaning up their houses, right? So now it's like January, February. They're cleaning up their houses. Stuff has been floating in their basements and living rooms. They've dried out these photographs. They're horribly damaged. Some of them are old silver photographs and are completely destroyed.
They call those tin types.
Exactly. So we brought a team in, and the team was about 8 of us on the ground and several hundred across the world. And what would happen is we would scan it using our latest scanning technology, so broad spectrum scanning. We would then upload those photographs out to our network around the world. People would go into Photoshop and whatever tool they wanted to use, restore them, and then we'd print them out locally and give them back to the local residents. So these were photographs that were absolutely lost.
Did this project have a name? Did Hewlett-Packard call this something?
No, we were part of the publicity stuff was really handled by, there was a TV show and it was called, it's like Home Renovation or something.
Was that with Bob Vila?
It wasn't the Bob Vila one. It was the one with Kyle or somebody. We may have to go look this up and put it in the show notes. But it was essentially one of these large ABC News Home Renovation or Project Home Renovation, some title like that. And we became a segment on it where, because they loved the reveals, right? Remember those shows of that era? They loved the reveal, and we were the perfect reveal. Because when we had the reveal session where we would give all these photographs back, the tears would flow like crazy. Let me tell you about the amazing restoration we did. There was one that was one of these tin photographs. It was white when I got it. And we scanned it and we sent it out to a couple of our specialists. And we were able to pick up enough of the silver material on this white sheet of photographic paper to actually do a restoration of the photograph. It was pretty incredible. It just happened to be that this photograph belonged to the head of the fire department. So it was quite a moment to see a fellow who's 6 foot something burst into tears when he's got a picture of his great-grandfather. So very rewarding, very technical. We had to keep it all running. We had to keep it all running with generators. It was sort of a precursor for me to field day. And we had to do our budgets because we were scanning gigs and gigs and gigs of photographs and then uploading them, but we only had so much bandwidth to do it. So one of my jobs was to optimize the uploads beyond my amateur electrician skills. So yeah, that was quite a project. I will never forget it. It was a lot of fun. And I think we did a little bit of good. But as I said, it got me back in the mood, sort of a field day mode, and it got me thinking, yeah, this radio thing, I need to get back to that.
Okay, so here you are. You've rekindled this interest in radio after your stint in New Orleans, which is an amazing story. What happened after that?
So basically I went back and I reconnected with some friends that I had, military friends, that in the 709 Communications Regiment in Toronto. And I said, hey, is anybody doing a course? And just so happened, as part of their extension, so their basically ability to work with the community, they were running a course for military folks on ham radio licensing. So I said, get me in. I got to take that ticket. And the timing worked out perfectly. So within, I guess, a month, because we had live classes, I had my basic ticket. And then since I was in school mode, I kept going and I self-studied on my advanced. So those are the two levels of licensing in Canada. So basic and basic with honors. Basic with honors is when you get a high mark on the basic exam, you get your HF privileges. So basic is VHF, UHF. Basic with honors allows you to get HF privileges. And then advanced, hey, just seemed like the right ticket to keep going with once you're in school mode. And advanced allows you to be involved in building repeaters and all sorts of other good stuff. So, yeah, very quickly I went from zero to, and at this point, it had just so happened we were out of the CW requirement. It had just been dropped. So it was my inability to do CW wasn't a problem. I'm one of those horrible no-code hams.
You got your first license then in 2006?
Yes.
Right after Katrina? And you went from zero to advanced in the same session or within a short period of time?
A short period of time. I sat the exams separately, but probably within 2 months, I would think, because I went from studying from one to studying to the other right away.
And was VA3ON the first call sign?
VE3RHF for Rod Hardman frequency, I don't know. VE3RHF was my original license. I didn't get my two-letter call until much later and quite by coincidence. I logged on to the Industry Canada site one day, and as you do, in Ontario, two-letter calls are completely impossible to get. So one day I just happened to be logging in, and I think they're doing some site maintenance, which means that it was hard to log into. I remember it being difficult to log into. And I looked at available call signs, as I always do, on there to see if there's any two levels or two-letter calls, two-letter suffixes. And there was ON for Ontario. Hey, wow. And so I grabbed it immediately, and then the site collapsed.
Are those calls made available because Ham has passed away or his license has expired?
Yes.
Do you know the history of the VA3ON call in terms of who had it before?
So there's a chap who I don't have at my fingertips here that was VA3ON before. I believe he was out of Northern Ontario. I have talked to his son at one point, which was kind of cool. But the way it works in Canada is you get a call sign for life. So there are the fees. Once you pay them, you're done, which means it's a little difficult to retire call signs unless the family is really good about retiring those. And as a result, a number of the two-letter calls are, as I said, extremely rare, at least in Ontario, where most of the hams in Canada are.
How many hams do you think are in Canada? In Toronto, perhaps, in the Ontario territory?
You got me there, my friend. It's in the thousands, and I should know this number off the top of my head, but I just don't.
Also, I think, isn't Toronto like one of the largest cities?
By far.
By far. So we're talking millions of people in the Toronto surrounding area?
Yeah, the hobby is not that popular, but when you're in the dense environment of a large city, you do find a fair number of hams that you get to hang out with and make good things happen. So field days are good around Toronto. They're fairly sizable. We have some clubs that are several hundred members that get out and have, I think, Mississauga, which is a neighboring community, runs something like 15A or 17A, something like that.
And that means that 17 operating positions?
17 simultaneous transmitters, which to me is just a recipe for disaster, but you managed to make it work. and all within the amount of space that we're allowed for field day. So some of these can be big operations.
That's awesome technically. I mean, when you think about the amount of brain power concentrating on a problem over a weekend, I mean, it's awesome.
It's also pretty impractical.
Of course, but it doesn't have to be practical. It just has to be awesome.
No, and that's the whole point. Like, field day is different things to different people, which is what got me interested in it in the first, that was one of my big passions and has been forever. One of my favorite activities is operating field day. And that's because of the technical challenge of that many antennas existing within such a fairly small space, not blowing up your neighbor, which is kind of important. The ability to, just the logistics, feeding everybody, keeping the shifts running, keeping the generators running, all that sort of stuff. Remember, this appeals back to everything I've talked about so far, right?
Right.
Logistics side of it. And I joined the Oakville Club, and the Oakville Club was a great contester club. There's some amazing operators in the Oakville Club. I was not one of them. I was brand new. So how am I going to make myself useful? Well, I knew generators. I can do that. I know logistics. I can do that. So that was where I made my contribution. And, Oakville's got a bunch of, humble, smart guys, some great mentors for me. It was really a great learning experience where I could go from not just my paper licenses, but really get a practical sense of how things work. You got to join a club. You got to be part of at least a regular field day operation, and that will bring your skills right up.
What was your first rig?
I went and got, aside from the inevitable handheld 92A D-Star, always loved D-Star, but my first HF rig was an IC7200, which is, no surprise, the military-style version of ICOM's line. Why? It was relatively inexpensive. It was super rugged. It looked like something I'd used before. It was simple to operate. And when I bought it, it was before pan adapters were really a thing. It will live very nicely in the field. It will live very nicely with improvised antennas. So I still love that rig. I've still got it today. And that is every ham should have a loaner rig, right? Should have a rig that they can reliably give. Yeah, at least, yeah. That you can reliably loan to somebody that's new to the hobby and that they can't blow it up. They can't go wrong, and it's simple enough to use. And the great part about that rig, too, is that you can do digital on it. It was one of the first USB connectable radios that I was aware of. And like I said, I still love it because it's kind of rugged and it sits in a big old Rubbermaid container and it comes out when it needs to.
And at this point, you're married.
Yes.
You may have children along the way, right?
I've got children along the way. My eldest daughter is now 19. She got licensed when she was 13 or 12.
So there was support for the hobby then in your family. It wasn't that you were headed off in another direction.
The kids like coming out to field day too. So it was a great opportunity for that. The whole family's always been big on camping. So that was not a major departure for us. And it was something that, although my youngest sometimes rolls her eyes at the ham radio stuff, and I don't expect any of them to be very, very active hams, but my youngest is studying for her exam right now, along with my wife, by the way. So I might get I might get a sweep here of operators within the household. Now, I will say the real reason they're doing it is because we have a cottage north of Kingston, which is Eastern Ontario, that has terrible cell service. And my family loves this broken down Sea-Doo that we've got running around on the lake.
And what is that?
So that's a watercraft. It's basically a personal watercraft that runs up and down. You can put one or two people on it.
It looks like a motorcycle on the lake?
Yeah. And the deal is we are fairly remote on that lake. And I have some safety concerns with a 10-plus-year-old Sea-Doo getting out on a lake where it's really hard to call for help. So they have decided, they came to me with a proposal. It says, if we got our licenses, and this is specifically my 14-year-old now, has said, if I get my license, can I run the Sea-Doo? And that's hard to say no to.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. I think I heard you talk about this in the last Workbench podcast. I stay to the very end, but it sounds to me like there's also perhaps a repeater project that could be involved in this.
There is. We have a very active, in a neighboring town, the town of Perth, Ontario. There is a very active ham radio community. In fact, they even get involved with balloon flights. They call themselves the Perth Space Agency. So well worth looking up. They've got some great stuff going on. But they've got repeaters up and linked repeaters around the lakes. And I am seriously considering putting up a repeater at the site because we're up on a little bit of an escarpment over the lake. We have great reach. And I think it would be a wonderful addition to the community because we're in a little bit of a spot that we can get to the repeaters, but not great coverage. So if we added it to the network, it would be really something. And it's, of course, pretty selfish on my part. I just want to have a cool repeater out there. And we just got internet in, so we might even be able to put a digital repeater in. So D-Star, here we come.
I heard this idea of using D-Star. I'm not sold because no one uses D-Star in this part of the world, and I've never tried it. So maybe I should try it, and then I would maybe be a D-Star supporter.
Yeah.
I kept hoping when I was listening to the episodes that All-Star, he'll do All-Star out there.
You never know. I'm not going to fully commit to this, but D-Star was my first love. It was the very first handheld I ever bought, and they were fairly new, the 92A, and people that know Mike Walker know that we're probably the last two owners of 92As out there, 92ADs, sorry. And I just loved it because I was a network guy, right? So I was doing networks and servers at HP, that kind of thing. And to me, if you understand how routers work, understanding how D-Star works makes total sense. So that was really my attraction to it. I love all the digital modes. It's just, I was looking at my inventory of radios, and I've got, I think 4 D-Star handhelds in various states of repair.
I think when you came into amateur radio, ICOM also had a very generous program where they were selling repeaters, VHF, UHF, and I think 900 megahertz for nothing. I mean, practically nothing.
If they bring it back in the next few months, I'm there. We'll have to see. We'll see what it works out to be. But this is all my favorite stage for a project, which is the planning stage.
Yeah, mine too. Yeah.
We'll see what we can do with it and what we can build up in the community. But one of the guys on Workbench called me he says, well, what are you going to do about FM, or what are you going to do about this? And I was joking at the time, I think it made it into the show, that there's one thing that we do really well on Workbench is over-spec projects. And it may end up being a multiple repeater site. Who knows?
Right. I can see this. Well, I'm sorry, actually, that D-Star never made it here, on the one hand. On the other hand, we're in a situation here where we have lots of infrastructure that nobody uses. I don't know how to turn that around. At some point, you'll have to give me some advice. Let me ask you, so how did this ham radio journey evolve from there? Can you talk more about, I saw something here called Cycle 25. Now, we're not referring to the sunspot cycle, are we?
No, we're not. And there's an interesting reason for that title. So to go back just a little, and then I'll come straight back to this. If you are a, quote, young, unquote, ham in a club, you often get kind of railroaded into helping lead the club. And for the Oakville Club, very much. So with some really wonderful folks, shout out to Peter West, VE3HG, and Mike Cotterman, who's now a VE1RR. who were incredibly supportive of me and worked with me on the club, and we did all sorts of great field days together. And that was going really, really well and growing really, really well until COVID hit. And actually before COVID and before the shutdowns, I was listening to something from the ICQ podcast. It was something they hosted with an RSGB session, and it was called The Importance of Hubs, Not Clubs. And it's a fascinating piece. It's based on an article. You can probably just search on Hubs, Not Clubs, RSGB, and you'd get that article. And the premise of the article is this, that we as ham radio aficionados, as we move from a world that is a brick and mortar store world into more of an Amazon world, you are seeing aggregators become far, far more important. And this fascinated me because it was like we were struggling with, how do you have enough resources? How do you have enough resources to have a good field day? Should clubs get together and team up for field days? The answer is yes, if you don't have the resources to run your own. And so we were going through this discussion, and then all of a sudden, shutdowns started. Our regular Saturday morning breakfast couldn't happen. And in Canada, we had such a long shutdown that we pretty much were continuously out for almost 2 years, which is a real problem for a club. So I started up this online Zoom call with the premise of that we would have a call that we could get together once a week, just have a round table, just like we had at the breakfast table. We could do presentations. We could do all sorts of good stuff that way. I called it Cycle 25. Why? Because, well, Cycle 25 was starting up, but here is the secret reason for people that actually pay attention. I thought if I started this thing up, I didn't want to be doing it more than about 12 years later. So I figured by the time Cycle 26 hit, I'd be out of there. The name would be obsolete. We'd be doing something else. And it was kind of a fun name to use, and off we went with that. And it started out as being something for the Oakville Club to get together, but through my friend George of Workbench fame, and through some others joining, we have made it more of a North American thing. So we run at, I guess, 11:30 a.m. Eastern time zone, so it's pretty encompassing. We have several people from Europe out with us on Saturday mornings. It's been really rewarding because if I have one superpower, it's that I collect really smart people into groups, really talented and smart people. And it's not saying that I am at all, but I managed to get people into the same place at the same time. And it has been really, really rewarding because we were able to get, as I said, the right people on the right call at the right time. Now, one of the deals with this, and I don't suggest, this was never intended to be a big thing. I don't intend to have hundreds of members. It wouldn't be workable as hundreds of members. But if somebody's interested in doing this themselves, it's easy enough to start. You just got to collect the right people. But what made the formula work for us is that we alternate a round table on 1 week, and then the next week we do presentations through the regular year. Summers we're a little looser on it. But everyone that joins has to be able to present. And I don't care what you present on. It doesn't matter, because there's lots of aspects to this hobby to present. But I need presenters. And so we've recruited a lot of them organically. And I mean, we've had some really cool people and also guests on. I mean, we've had Scott Wright.
K0MD, right?
K0MD, of an amazing, kind, wonderful, and incredibly smart guy. I'm going to just try to rhyme off people. John Portun's a member.
In fact, I'll put a link to, I think you've got a YouTube page that has 3 videos on it, but I think one of those videos has the group together, or there's a picture somewhere.
There is. And there's actually, the one that we post our talks on is youtube.com/cycle25. So cycle 25, all one word. And that has all our postings. You'll hear like Alan, the Scopes guy, that's W2AEW. I think you may have had him on as well.
Oh, sure, yeah. The test equipment guy.
Vince Dion is a good friend of mine. By the way, he's a good friend of mine from HP days before I was a ham. And neither one of us knew we got into the radio hobby, and we bounced into each other during a field day. That was hilarious.
Right, but he's also now one of the sidekicks on the Ham Radio Workbench podcast.
He is. He is. I brought him in because he is a detailed-oriented guy. Remember I said surrounding myself with smart people? Vince is one of the most detail-oriented people I know, and when we do the big live broadcasts, as you're well aware, that is a detailed thing to do. And so when we do the one that's the fundraiser for Georgia's network out in California.
Baycom, right?
Baycom, yeah. We do the Baycom livecast out there, and I pitch in with that, and I brought Vince in to help with that too, because the guy's magic. He makes really, really good things happen. So there's a whole list of folks. Mike Walker, we've had, but even some old friends like Bob Heil. Bob Heil interviewed my daughter when she first got her license. And, of course, I got him to return the favor and come do a talk for us for Cycle 25. So it's great to have the celebrities. But what ends up happening, strangely enough, if you've got a interesting enough crew, people rebound. These presenters that you thought you would have once, they come back. And Bob's come back a couple of times and just kind of hung out with us, which is really, really nice. So it's no pressure on him, and it's no pressure on anybody else. And we tend to be pretty self-sustaining. So I'm proud of the model. And if anything, like I said, I don't ever intend on this group to be that big, but I am more than happy to help people start up their own versions of it. And I've even worked with Denby Dale over in the UK, the Denby Dale Radio Club.
I was actually interviewed there.
They've got something very similar. They grabbed onto the same thing. And I'm seeing these pockets of groups that have realized that this hubs, not clubs concept really works well. And if we can be a resource that helps bring in new hams, that nurtures hams once they get their license, and also can even be just a way of keeping yourself sharp in the hobby. So what makes it all work is the membership, right? The right people and the right chemistry. And so we're very careful with who we recruit into the group. I know that sounds terribly elitist. It's not meant that way at all. It's meant about people chemistry, that they're the type of people that would get along with each other. And so that works out really well for us. And I think we've got a winning formula. But I do encourage people to think about doing it. I have no authorship on this thing at all. And I would love to see more organizations do this. George and I are talking about how do we even make nodes of this and make it into kind of a network. By the way, we don't charge anything for the club. We don't take dues. I do, people throw money at our internet bills every once in a while, which is very, very welcome. But it's not something that I never intended it to be a club. I never intended it to have dues. I never intended it to have like meetings of the finance committee or anything like that. It was intended to be just a group of friends that meet. And I think we've been relatively successful with that.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. Nuts and Bolts Magazine is a new sponsor and is an amazing resource for new and old hams alike. Click on the banner to get your online or paper subscription of Nuts and Bolts. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. I had this week kind of an interesting encounter. I was talking to Ian, G3ZHI, who I hear on the Win system when I'm using All-Star. And so he's submitted a paper for the project gallery in the expo in 2 weeks talking about, voice over IP services that hams are using. And so he sends me this link to this video conferencing system that he and his friends hang out on. And what they do is they put their smartphones on mounts in the windows of their cars. In this case, one of these hams in California is driving a semi-tractor trailer. And what you're doing is you're watching, he's pulling over, he's doing satellite contacts from the truck or from the space station as it's flying over. So you see him, he's pulling over, you hear the background, he's making these contacts. And then other people add on. So there was a guy from Morocco, a ham radio operator from Morocco, and he's driving home from work in the middle of the night. And it's kind of like these groups of hams have gotten together in their own way, expressing themselves in a very unique way in this particular case as well. But they're getting together and they're doing ham radio. So I couldn't believe it. I said to them, I couldn't possibly do this very much because I would never get anything done. Watching this ham in this semi-tractor trailer pulling a load of human excrement from one part of California to another for processing. But as the ISS is flying over, he pulls over to the side, he makes some ISS contacts, then he continues on. And it was like, this is absolutely habit-forming and addictive.
The last 2 field days, so these have been independent. We've been allowed to put our scores together as clubs, even though we're individual operators. And that has been great, but it's been missing that sense of community. So what we did, Cycle 25, in conjunction with one of the Alberta clubs that is also part of the Cycle 25 family, we put together a gigantic Zoom call for the duration of field day.
Oh, really? What an amazing idea.
Hilarious. And what was even funnier was the number of people that would join the call that weren't even operating for field day. They were just kind of checking in and seeing how everybody was doing. And this is something that, as I said, it's been 2 years now that we've done this call, and we do it during winter field day and other things. And it's been an absolute blast because especially when you're geographically distributed, California, Alberta, Toronto, you start hearing how things sound to other people. I think this is something, this isn't going away, right? Like the ability, we now have the ability to remote control an HF station somewhere else within our license classes, right? So you got to be careful. But when you can, it's a real mind blower because you listen on your local radio how something sounds, and then you log into, say, maybe not Mike Walker's, but log into Georgia's radio in California where I used to live, and I listen to it there and I go, oh wow, okay, yeah, it's not just the strength of the signal, it's the sound of the signal. And so you learn even more. And so when I had a couple of the local Army Cadet Corps got me to just recently, the last couple of years, go license some of their folks. So we ran classes on Zoom again. And part of what I was doing was logging into these different HF receivers and saying, okay, this is what it sounds like. And so there are 2 things that have really, really made a difference, I think, for young hams learning in the hobby right now. One is pan adapters. Absolutely. Man, if I had a pan adapter, I would have understood things so much more, so much better. And then secondly, being able to remote it because one, these are kids that get the network. And if they can go without buying their own rig and having to wire it all up and get all the attention, just listen to signals over the internet. That is huge in their learning curve. So that's made a massive, massive difference for me, at least the way to get the message through. And, the last thing I'll say about kids and radio is I think we need to adjust our expectations on just because you can get a 15-year-old to pass their license does not mean they're in the hobby from that point forward. And I actually take some of my own story on this going like, it would not have worked, right? Like I would not have been a continuous ham radio operator through that whole time. But they know what it's about and they've got the bug. And my theory is all these kids that we're licensing now are going to bounce back to us when they turn about 40, right? Because it's now their kids are starting to grow up and they've got a little more disposable income, that kind of thing. But we've got to be able to fuel that interest and keep that alive. To make that all work. And I think we've been relatively successful because of the distance tools.
No, I think you're right. What's your favorite operating mode now?
The last 2 years I've been going crazy on FT8. And I know it's ruining ham radio. Get over it.
I think it saved ham radio, actually.
It did, man. If you look at the numbers, and it brings in people that, okay, there are different types of operators in the world. Okay, there are kind of the theoretical operators. Like, I'm probably one of them. I love getting something set up with a new protocol and a new set of hardware and software and get it working and go, wow, this actually works. That is so cool. And I think George Z is one of those operators as well. And then there's contesters, and they just enjoy the back and forth, okay, like the racking up the numbers. And that's awesome. And that's just as valid. And then there's like DX hounds and all these different types of operators. But I think that we have to keep in mind that it's going to sound a little candy-coated to say there's room for everybody in the hobby, but we've got to nurture everybody in the hobby that way. So FT8, okay, I don't really care if you think it's ruining something. You thought that SSB ruined something. So, as I said, get over it.
When we went from AM to SSB, it's going to ruin the hobby.
But I mean, that's, if you listen to Workbench, you know that's a running joke for us, right? I love new entries of all sorts of things, and that it's because that's kind of addictive for me. Like, I want to go check out what that new protocol is, or I'll go check out an old digital protocol that I'd never used, like Olivia, name of my daughter, by the way. And no, she was not named after the protocol. But I will go and play with something on that. Right now, I'm kind of coming back to the digital modes. And then, weirdly enough, because of these discussions over the last little while, I'm coming back to UHF, VHF because, you know, I didn't spend a lot of time building repeaters from scratch, and I want to do that because I would always inherited repeaters, right? Like, I kind of knew how they worked and the club repeater and how to keep it up and running, that kind of thing, but I'd never built it from scratch. And I think that's part of my skill set I want to build out.
Well, I think that's a great skill set. I think that if you're in love with the art of radio, that it doesn't really matter what the modulation mode is or the operating mode is. If you're operating FT8, you have to know how to put together a transceiver, or at least, you know, unpack it. It has to be connected to an antenna on its resonant frequency, or it has to have some kind of tuner. So there's still a lot of ham radio expertise that goes into the art of radio to get even an FT8 station on the air.
Oh, there's a ton of moving parts. There's more moving parts than SSB, by far.
Right. So it's when people say it's the death knell for ham radio, I think they're talking about an operating mode, not the art of radio itself. And you alluded to George. I'm kind of like George, and that is I like technology. I like to build it to get it on the air and then go back and build something else. And it's the fascination with the technology that I have, probably more than a love of a specific operating mode.
If you are one of those individuals that can build something, whether it's a circuit board or a system, right? Like you've gone and purchased a new, you know, you're new to the hobby, you've purchased a transceiver, you've got your digital pieces of the puzzle, even your cabling. And once you've got it up and running, that first time that you see a line traced by in FT8, and if your sensation is, wow, that is so cool, and you feel like a little kid when you say that, you may not want to say that in front of other people, but that is the sensation you have. Or when a new operator comes on, the country you've never heard of before and you didn't think you could reach, whether it's FT8 or SSB, I don't care. And if your sensation was, that's really cool, I can't believe that works, you're in the right hobby, right?
Exactly.
And if you're not doing that, I don't quite get you, but that's okay. If you're getting something out of it, then that's fantastic. But I think the novelty of making something run of, you know, the creature breathes, right? That moment where it's actually all coming together is a wonderful moment. And I want to kind of give that joy to a bunch of other people as well. I see that within some kids I've worked with in the past where they're quite capable of doing something, but the light doesn't truly come on until, like, literally the light comes on, whether it's wiring up a circuit or whether it's like wiring up a house, like fixing a switch in their own house. That's really darn cool.
Right, the sense of empowerment.
Yeah.
Having some kind of control over the technology. I mean, I think we take it for granted that it all just works until it doesn't.
Yeah. The much maligned appliance operators in radio have, you know, that's not entirely valid, but extend that out to regular life. And you don't want people to be 100% buying a sealed box and wiring it up to the world, okay, or using it as a sealed box, whether it's a cell phone, whether it's whatever. I want people to understand a little bit of the mechanics, just a little bit, not the whole thing, just a little bit, so that they feel a little bit empowered to know good troubleshooting. If there's only one skill I want teenagers to learn, troubleshooting is how do I break a problem down so I can not be helpless? And that's, for each of us as operators, if we're imparting something onto our kids, onto our neighbors, onto whatever, no matter what age they are, I want them to figure out how to fix stuff, or at least have a chance of knowing what the problem is.
Well, do you think, obviously this could lead to a much larger discussion, but we can nip it in the bud, but do you think that, and I'm not talking about ham radio operators, maybe I'm talking, from a societal standpoint, and maybe ham radio is the cure for this, but do you think that in general, in the West, that we don't emphasize to our children that things don't just work? Maybe they just assume everything works until it doesn't work.
So at risk of being the cranky old guy, I will say this far. I work with developers all day in my day job, right? And I get to tease them from time to time because they are so high up on the extrapolated technology stack, and they're brilliant. Don't get me wrong. They're wonderful, but they're so high up and so away from the metal that sometimes you have to jolt them and say, okay, well, what's happening on a hardware level? What's happening down there? What's the influence of this effect within it? Even though they're not just doing software, they're doing high-level software. So you need to kind of break it down for them every once in a while. And every couple of years, I bring in a bunch of Raspberry Pis into my developers. And because they're all like great. They know Linux really, really well. But the idea that they would run it on their own hardware is sort of an alien concept to many of them. And it's now, in fairness, this can be a real productivity sink if you're going to do it at your own company. So be warned. But bringing that in is a really fascinating thing when they realize that the little thing they can hold in their hand, they can understand what the components on the board are, is really quite valuable in understanding the broader thing. So yeah, are we becoming more extrapolated from the base technology? Yes. Is that okay? Yes, in many cases. Are you a better debugger or coder by understanding what's going on down there? I think you absolutely are. You feel more fulfilled. You don't feel like a victim. You can control your own destiny. So, that's a bit of a rant all by itself.
Yeah, it's a nice rant, though. I think that at least amateur radio, for me, has kind of prepared me to think about, I've been doing it now almost 50 years, but prepared me to think about, how something works and when something doesn't work, where to start looking for it. If I hear an explosion in my attic, then I think it's because of my amateur radio background that says, oh, yeah, that's the hot water tank blowing up above my wife's office. And I know what to do about that. It becomes instinctual because I know how things work, and it's because of amateur radio that I think about everything as a system and how it must work. And I think that's one of the unique things about the hobby.
Yeah, my 14-year-old just this summer grabbed my multimeter out of the truck and was debugging the trailer lights for the Sea-Doo. And I didn't tell her. She just noticed that they didn't work. And so she's back and taking it apart. And I am, talk about proud papa moment. She did it without being prompted. And she figured it out. And she fixed it herself. And that was okay, this kid's going to be okay. In that little symbolic moment, right, where you realize that your kids have taken on ownership of being able to deal with the problem and not having to phone somebody. So, yeah, it's so important that we encourage those skills, and it's not just a youth thing. It could be your neighbor. It could be anybody. And, of course, this is the same kid who now riding in the truck with me starts commenting on different antennas and what they do. The thing when as soon as you become ham, you notice what all different antennas are. And
I think this is part of the human condition. Let's say you decide as a teenager that you're interested in a Datsun, I'm dating myself, a Datsun 510.
Yes.
Well, all of a sudden, you see Datsun 510s everywhere that you never noticed before. And it's the same thing with ham radio. This is once you get into repeaters, for example, then you start noticing repeater sites on every hill you pass.
Absolutely.
You can't help it.
And that has been throughout my whole life. I've tried to learn about the next thing. And I think that's going to keep me alive. It's at least going to keep my brain working. And I think that's why hams kind of tend to last longer than others, is that we keep working on what the next thing is, what the next piece of technology is, and trying to understand it.
Right, or what's the next problem to solve?
Mm-hmm.
One of the difference between men and women, my wife reminds me, but then I hear this also, is that as a man, if my wife comes to me and she wants to talk about a problem she has, then my brain is designed that, and it's also from ham radio, that I'm supposed to listen to her problem and I'm supposed to come up with a solution. And she'll look at me after she sees the brain spinning. She says, "You're just supposed to listen."
Yes.
So I once told her, I said, I think that unless you want your problem solved, you should find a girlfriend to talk to where you just want someone to listen. I'm not wired that way. I'm wired to solve problems.
Eric, you are in dangerous ground there.
It's a terrible thing.
I am not going there because my wife may listen to this.
Well, I hear this is a male thing. Maybe it's because we were the hunter-gatherers millions of years ago.
I think so.
And so we're out there to slay dragons and solve problems. And we're not very good passive listeners. I think that ham radio aggravates this.
I would challenge that just a little, because I'm noticing in my daughters, while it tends to be a male trait, I'm noticing in my daughters, and maybe it's because they're very active on the sports front, they're very assertive, I've pumped a whole bunch of confidence into these kids. I'm noticing them to be much more ready to take on problems and to solve their own problems. And again, that makes me feel good because I think they're going to be well equipped. So I'm not sure whether that's shifting or not. We'll have to see in the long run.
So maybe it's ham radio, Rod. Maybe it's actually ham radio that is causing people, and so it will cross the boundary between men and women, that women ham radio operators are also trained to solve problems, because that's kind of what the hobby demands. It demands that we look at what we want to do or the problem we want to solve, and we figure out ways to do it. And maybe we collaborate with each other to get some ideas on how we might solve that problem.
And the evidence does support that, right? If we think about the women ham operators that we know, there's some wicked smart, very capable people out there.
This is absolutely true. And you can hear some of these people at the next QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo in their presentations.
Nice.
Okay, well, there's one more thing. I obviously have my last questions, but on your Twitter account, you make a point that you're a herder of cats. What does that mean?
Okay, remember when I said I collect smart people around me? Smart people are a lot like cats. They tend to wander around. They tend to, And to have the right mass of cats available to do some really, really cool stuff, there's a certain amount of herding. So I do find, I guess because I'm involved in a lot of different projects, that's cat herding of a sort.
I see. So Cycle 25 would be an example.
Absolutely.
I had taken that very literally, and I actually have, in the expo, I have a speaker who's talking about herding cats, and he's talking actually about an ARES project that he did. And then somebody sent me a brilliant EDS commercial that was out some years ago of you've got these real live cowboys out in Wyoming herding cats.
Yeah, it's. I hate to disappoint you. There's an awful lot of CGI in that one, but I do remember that commercial clearly because EDS had become part of the HP family right about that time.
It was brilliant. It was really a brilliant commercial.
It's awesome, but I still love that clip because it does. You visualize that sometimes humans are very difficult to focus, and if there are enough people out there that are helping that along, and that does not mean command and control. That means gentle encouragement, getting the right people and the right situations together, then we can do incredible things. But left to our own devices, we tend to be like cats, like just generally breaking things and knocking stuff over. So, there is a role very much in the world, at least I think there is, for cat herding, although it's not exactly a celebrated role.
What do you think the greatest challenge is facing amateur radio now?
Being clear in the communication of our relevancy. And a lot of it's what we talked about today. The relevancy is not that we can transmit on our on HF on this frequency. No. It's the thinking style. It's the ability to debug something. It's the ability to go down to the component level and understand what's going on. That's what ham radio teaches you. And that's the real skill. The other stuff is just kind of window dressing. I think it will be critical to make sure we keep that in mind as we grow the hobby. And the hobby is growing. This little pause of isolation has actually helped us. But to make sure that when somebody asks the question, hey, I can call somebody on the other side of the planet with my cell phone, why do I need a ham radio? The answer has nothing to do with talking to somebody on the other side of the planet per se. It's got to do with the method and the science and the application and the learning process that happens along the way. So I think if we keep that in razor sharp resolution, then we'll be in good shape.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
Change, change, change. I am really welcoming, as I said, new protocols, new technology. We live in an embarrassment of riches. There are, HF rigs are not cheap, but relative to income in past years, they're cheaper. Parts are really available, more so than ever. How you can go to a parts manufacturer and have something at your doorstep the next day. How cool is that? Now, notwithstanding certain parts limitations at the moment, so fair enough. But wow, the things I can do today that I couldn't do 15 years ago blow your mind.
It is like that. I mean, I can get a DigiKey package here in a week.
Yeah.
On the other side of the world.
Yeah, exactly.
Free shipping.
It's the miracle of logistics. It's the miracle of focus. But what we don't want to do is don't lose the combination of being able to dive down to a component level with the access to the components, because that's a powerful thing. And I don't want people building stuff. When we talk about stuff on Workbench, I don't want you building an audio controller or something because you have to, although that's kind of nice. I want you to build it because you want to figure out how to build something. And that, I think, is a super critical thing to take on.
Or you want to understand what it is that you're using.
Every kid should be able to solder properly, even though it should be a high school course. Why not? Every kid should be able to look at, to take something apart, take their favorite appliance apart, and at least look at the components and be able to pick out the main ones.
And put it back together so your mom isn't upset.
Hopefully. I'm not sure I did that every time, but I sure tried.
Or start with small things. Don't start with the dishwasher.
Especially not the dishwasher.
For example.
Yeah, good example, though.
What advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
If you're returning, then you're looking at a bit of a learning curve, and look at that as an advantage, where things need to, well, actually for both. There's a hell of a learning curve for this hobby. Don't be overwhelmed, because the fun of it is not getting your license. The license is, and you've heard this many times before, the license is the beginning. The education process is what follows the license. And embrace the education process for the joy that it is. Okay? If you don't like learning, you're in the wrong hobby. But if you do like learning, you've got an unlimited hobby. So, yeah, embrace it. Have fun with it. Don't get frustrated.
I think that's wonderful advice. This has been a lot of fun for me. With that, I want to wish you 73, and thanks again for joining me on the QSO Today podcast.
7-3, and thanks for the opportunity.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Rod. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in VA3ON in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to click on the Expo menu item at the top of the page for updates on the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. Your support of the Expo greatly helps us to create and share the amazing video resources that further contribute to the art of radio. My thanks to ICOM America for their continued support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of this fine sponsor by clicking on their link in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, click on the transcribe button at the top of the show notes page. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. By using the Amazon link on the home page before you shop at Amazon allows Amazon to send us a small commission on what you purchase that further keeps our QSO Today project going. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as we work towards episode 500. QSO Today is now available on a large number of podcast players and now a host of podcast services and applications. We are Podcast 2.0 compatible. I now use the Fountain podcast player to listen to all of my favorite podcasts. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.